For me, the key to successful trimming is having your pieces at just the right stiffness to be able to do the job. This is a piece that I threw a few days ago, and I moved it onto this wood board. It's almost the right stiffness. What I want to do is pick the piece off the board and flip it upside down. You'll notice that the bottom stump part of your pieces are always going to hold the water longer. It's always going to be thicker clay down here, and that's where the water is going to tend to congregate while you're throwing, whereas the rims are always thinner and it's going to tend to dry out more quickly on the rim. So what I want to do is flip this piece upside down so that the bottom clay is exposed to the air. If you're lucky, you'll be able to just pop it up off the board. That wood should absorb the moisture from the clay, and when it does, it should release naturally on its own. This isn't coming off quite yet. I could just wait a little longer and it will come off eventually. What I think I'm going to do is recut it with the wire to loosen it from the board. Hold your thumbs down tight on the board. Don't lift up and cut up into your piece. I really want to make sure that this bottom surface is level with the rim of the piece, because when I trim it, I'm going to have it upside down on the wheel head, and if that's not level or if the rim's not level, it's going to be really tricky to trim this. But now I have exposed this more soft clay here, and it's going to dry out more evenly. If I wanted to really help it dry evenly, I would wrap the rim in plastic. I want the piece to be perfectly even, middle cheese hard all the way throughout. These are some of my favorite trimmed pieces from our collection of pots that we use every day. On this piece, I really love how rounded this bottom area of the pot is. I love the continuous sweeping curve on the inside that's perfectly mirrored by the curve on the outside of this piece. I also like the depth of the foot ring here. And if your foot ring is deep enough, like this one is, sometimes you can gauge it by holding a stick across the foot. But if it's deep enough, you can put a glaze in that center area of your pieces also. This piece has a different character to it, an even deeper foot ring where the artist has intentionally made steps or ridges or kind of a zigzag down here that's echoed into this ridge line on the bottom part of the piece also. There's no glaze in the center area of the foot, but this is a foot that I can definitely use as like a handle for this bowl. My fingers interact with this in kind of a delightful way every time I pick it up. And I like the comfortable, casual, confident feeling that this foot brings to the bowl. On some pieces, the foot becomes the most stylistically engaging and interesting part of the whole piece. I think that the artist here really communicated a lot about their relationship in handling the clay material with the foot on this bowl. Here's a nice trimmed foot that's got just a little bit of a flare out where it sits on the table. And I especially appreciate how the artists use their signature stamp right here in the very center of the piece. Here's a really nice trimmed foot ring on this bowl-like of a big cup. And here the artist cut kind of a undercut or a bevel on the foot. Very confident foot with a spiral brought into the clay right in the center area. And on this bowl-like cup, there's a really deep foot ring. This ring is almost an inch deep. They really left a lot of extra thickness of clay down there intentionally. So sometimes the foot of the piece can be the most important part of it. It's how the piece sets on the table. Sometimes it's how it enters the world around us. It can really give a lot of personality to your work. I like to think of the foot of the piece as being like the kind of shoe that you're wearing with your outfit. It can really set off an entire outfit. It can be the most important part of what you're wearing that day. It can say a lot about your personality, and sometimes they're more minimal and more anonymous. Sometimes the trimmed area of your piece is just about cleaning it up. Sometimes it creates a whole new shape down there. I usually try to keep trimming to a minimum. I usually don't do too much fancy stuff down there, but you might really get into that part of finishing your pieces. Here's a piece that is perfectly even cheese hard. It's a good idea to just feel the piece out and have one hand on the inside and one hand on the outside. You can literally feel how thick the clay wall is throughout, and the floor. Especially, I want to get a sense right in the bullseye. That tends to sometimes be a thin spot going across the floor, and in this area right here, the bottom third of the piece, I want to get a sense with my fingertips of how thick that is before I go to trim it. Once I attach it upside down on the wheel head, I'm not going to have access to this kind of information that my fingers are telling me right now. Here's a piece that I'm going to cut in half and show you the cross section to talk about the area that you want to trim. Again, cutting your pieces in half is a really great way to see how your throwing is progressing. By looking at the cross section, you can see how thick it is down in this bottom corner of the piece. I like this consistent thickness throughout until we get to right about here. It's usually in the bottom third of the piece where extra thickness resides. And I can tell that it's a little thicker in the floor area as well. This is a big reason why it's important to get some consistency in your throwing. This is also why I'm encouraging you to work in a series format so that you can become accustomed to the amount of extra clay at the bottom of your pieces for consistent results when trimming. It's a good idea to envision what you're going to trim off before you do. On this piece, I'm going to draw a little line with the tip of my pin tool and outline the area that I'm going to trim off. I'm going to bring the foot in more narrow, and I'm going to trim off about half of the floor, and I'm going to thin out this bottom part of the curve. This shows me the right amount of clay and how much I might trim on future pieces in order to get a consistent, even thickness throughout my piece. The footprint of the piece has an effect on how we interact with the piece. If it's a very wide foot, it's gonna make for a more stable object. If it's a very narrow foot ring, it might seem more like a presentation piece, like it's up on a pedestal or maybe wearing a high-heeled shoe or something like that. The foot and how it sits on the table can really affect the personality of the piece. So I do take that measurement into consideration with the overall design of my pot. You'll find it's a lot easier to trim if you take the bat off the wheel head. Don't use a bat when you trim unless you happen to have a pot with a mouth diameter that literally hits on the two bat pins. Then you'd need a bat in order not to mess up the rim. But for all other cases, I take the bat off and I'm going to attach the pot directly on the metal wheel head. I find this is easier because the metal wheel head has concentric rings in it. And so it should be relatively easy to line up your piece in the exact center. Look at the rings on the wheel head and center it. Of course, if you're throwing pieces that aren't perfectly centered, then it's going to be impossible to recenter them upside down because they won't have a center. So sometimes there's a little bit of a fudge factor involved in recentering your pieces. Also, if the rim is not level, it's going to make this surface unlevel, and that can be challenging. Of course, you want to make sure that the surface is clean so when you flip it upside down, you don't get marks and crumbs on the rim. I'm going to line that up inside the rings, and then I'm going to hold it down with some slugs of soft clay. Usually I roll out something that's about the size of a big fat worm, and I usually roll out 3 of them and attach them around the sides of the piece. I'm pushing them in kind of gently, but with a little bit of firmness to make sure that they're holding this pot in place on the wheel head. This piece has a really deep throwing ring in it, and it had the result of making it a little off center. It's slightly off center. It's sometimes common for a piece to have a different centered alignment on the bottom part of it from the top part of it, and I think that's the case with this piece. The area of your pot that you really want to have on center is the bottom third of your pot. That's the area that you're going to be trimming on, and it's really important for this bottom third area to be on center so that you have control while you're trimming it. And I can tell from feeling it, the way it's bumping my finger out here as it goes around, I can tell just from looking at it that there's something a little off on this bottom third area. So I'm going to show you this little trick to bring it on center. I'm going to use the wood tool from my toolkit, but you could use a pin tool or your thumbnail or a pencil. And I'm going to hold totally steady on one side, and I'm going to let the piece bump against me. By holding steady and making a mark on the side that's bumping out towards me, I can more clearly see where the piece is extended out off of the central axis too far. It's this side of the pot that's sticking out too much. So I'm gonna bring it back into center this way. I'm just gonna nudge it about 1/4 of an inch. I'm gonna reattach it with my clay here and check it a second time. Hopefully there's some improvement. I'm gonna go ahead and move the tip of my tool down slightly so I don't confuse the second round of marks with the first mark that I made. The lower mark is showing me that it's this side of the pot that's now sticking out a little bit too far. And like I said, this piece has a really deep spiral on it, and it may be that I'm not able to bring this bottom stump part of it into perfect centered alignment. When I trim, I like to use this double-ended loop tool, and I'm pretty much just going to use the square tip of it. I like to get the tool in the palm of my right hand, and my right index finger is going to go where the loop comes into the shaft of the tool. And I get a really firm, what I call a white knuckle grip on this tool. I'm going to hold the tool at the 3 o'clock position. My left hand is going to apply slight downward pressure, or at least these fingers are going to glide along on the bottom here while the piece is turning around. And my left thumb is going to bridge over to my right hand, helping to hold my 2 hands steady. Again, with trimming, it's really important that your elbows are in on your sides and your knees are in on the pan, your arms are down, and your whole upper body, your whole body is clenched and in a locked body position. Usually the part of the piece that's the most uneven is the toenail area. And you can tell right now that this would be easier if I had done a better job of cleaning that area when I was done throwing it. Oftentimes trimming can reveal things that you wish you'd done differently in the throwing process. So I usually like to get this most uneven, bumpiest part first. And I'm going to even that up by holding steady with the trimming tool in a clenched body position, and I'm going to come into the clay and cut some off. It can often be a pretty bumpy ride at first, and you really just have to clench up with your grip on the tool to get some control here. Once you've trimmed off the unevenness of the toenail area, the rest of it can be easier. I'm going to switch to the bigger trimming tool now that comes in your toolkit, and I often like to use this this kind of bottom curved area of the piece because it's a little better suited for making broad sweeping curves. I'm going to hold the tool on this area that I just created from bringing in the foot. So I'm going to hold the tool steady, and then I'm going to bring it down in a curve across the bottom part of that piece. You notice that I'm rotating the tool as it comes down. I want there to be a curve in this area. I don't want it to be straight. I want it to be rounded. So to make it like that, I have to curve my hand in sweeping the tool down. And if I want to make this more narrow, I can do that now. But you want to watch out that you don't make the foot too narrow, because you're never going to be able to make it wider again. And as it gets too narrow, your piece can become unstable when it sits upright. I'm going to clean up on this very bottom part of the piece also. To do this, I'm going to start with the tool in the bullseye, and then I'm slowly going to move it out to the 3 o'clock position. Slightly switching the hand position with my trimming tool. You're going to find your own particular ways of holding the trimming tool. The important thing is just that you hold it in a way so that you can get a firm, solid grip on it. I'm going to start with it in the bullseye of the piece. My floor is a little uneven. It's not quite level. So as I come out, I notice that I'm cutting off the uneven area. I'm actually making it more level as I sweep across the floor. Every time I come across, I'm making it a little more level. Again, start in the bullseye and slowly sweep across the floor towards the 3 o'clock position. Gently release pressure and just float off the edge when you get there. I like to make the floor a little bit lower in the middle area. I'm going to cut away a little bit more here in the center, and I'm going to progressively lighten my touch as I come out to the edge. Cutting away more here in the middle will actually help the piece sit more level on the tabletop. So you'll notice if I hold a straight edge across it, that there's a little bit of airspace here in the middle. My floor is actually slightly concave, and that will help it sit more stable when I flip it upright. It's a good idea as you're trimming to stop every few minutes and do a little assessment of where you're at and how much you've trimmed off already. I'm going to do that by pressing in, and I'm trying to feel the thickness by seeing if there's any give in the wall. If I can press enough that it actually indents, then I know that I'm at the right place to stop. I don't feel any give yet. It still feels pretty solid. So I can tell I have enough thickness in this area that I can still trim some more off. When I push on the floor area right here though, I can feel it move. I can feel it sway down in. So I know right there I've trimmed enough. I'm not going to take any more away from that center area, but I can take some more away from right here. If it helps, you could always remove the piece when you're maybe at the halfway point and feel it again between your two hands and get a sense there of how much more you have left to trim. There's nothing wrong with taking this off halfway through, feeling it out, reminding your brain how much thickness is actually there, and then putting it back on and finishing the job. Lots of times when trimming, you'll inadvertently leave ridges or sharp edges or spirals in the piece. The trimming tools can be kind of sharp. And so when I'm done, I always do a final round of smoothing. I wouldn't want to leave an edge this sharp on the foot ring. I want it to have a smooth finish. Everyone's going to notice that right where it hits the table. And you want that to be a clean, smooth, finished edge. Also, when you're done trimming, you leave this scratchy surface on here. It exposes the grog in the clay. Oftentimes the glaze won't melt very smoothly over an area that's been trimmed like that. And I want the trimmed area to have the same compressed, smooth polish to it that the rest of the piece has. I want this bottom corner to have a slight rounded edge to it. If your piece is a little on the dry side, you can add just a little bit of water, but you don't want to add enough water so that it runs down the surface of your piece. And now I'm going to go over it with my rubber rib, or sometimes you can just use your fingers. A rubber rib can help, and I'm going to smooth it back down. I'm compressing all that grog back into the wall of clay, and I'm finishing the surface, especially right here on the bottom floor. The foot ring can also be an important part in the piece because that's where the glaze is going to end. So when I glaze this pot, I'm going to bring the glaze down right to this corner right here, and I'm going to leave that 1/4 inch of the pot unglazed. Usually this attachment clay will cleanly peel off. If the attachment clay you were using was nice soft clay straight from the bag, and if the pot you were trimming was medium cheese hard, that usually peels off no problem. Sometimes you'll get some little extra stray crumbs of clay left there, and you want to come now and make sure that's all cleaned off. Now is when you want to really evaluate the trimming job that you did. Feel the piece in your hands and try and get a sense if there's any area in it that's still kind of heavy, that's still a little thicker, that holds some extra weight that you might not want on your piece. And look at it. Look at the proportional relationships of the piece. Ask yourself, is that foot at the right diameter? Is it the right height? I feel like on this piece, my foot could actually be a little narrower. Maybe on the next one, I'll try and bring that in a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and cut this one in half and show you what it looks like after the trimming. I feel like this piece is completely even all the way down until we get right about here. And I feel like I could have trimmed off just a hair more right there. And maybe I wish I had brought this foot in a little narrower. Attaching a piece like this upside down could be a little tricky because it's really thin at the rim, and also it rests just on those 4 points. It seems like it's wobbling a little bit. If you feel like you need to, you could put some extra clay like this underneath the rim of the piece to help hold it in place. Especially if you have a rim that's uneven, you could put a little pillow of extra clay under one side to help level your piece out. So again, before you attach it, you want to really feel out the thickness that you have there and get a good sense logged in your brain of how much clay you can afford to cut away from your piece, and really look at it and ask yourself the diameter and shape of the foot ring that would best complement this piece. Try and envision what it's going to look like beforehand, because once you attach it upside down like this, you're pretty much just seeing it from the top down. It's a good idea to bend over, lean over, and look at your piece while you're trimming it. I'm going to line it up in the middle here and attach it with 3 slugs of clay. At first, the attachment might be a little loose. I'm going to use the tip of my trimming tool as a guide and let the piece bounce against it, so I know where the mark is left over here is where the piece is sticking out too far. So I'm going to nudge that side back onto the center a little bit. It was about 1/4 inch. I moved it right there. Tack it back down and test it again. And I can see from the lower mark kind of in the same area, telling me maybe I didn't move it quite enough. I'm gonna nudge it back from there just a little bit at a time. Using the square tip of the trimming tool held super firmly in my right hand, I'm going to start on the toenail of the piece and I'm going to come in and trim that off. You can see here, if I have a loose grip, that the clay is bumping my tool around, and in order to get a clean, even trimmed foot here, I need to clench up and not let it jaggle my fingers around. I need to firm up and cut off that uneven toenail. I'm gonna start to make this bottom part of the piece more narrow. And as I do that, I start to leave a sharp corner here on the rounded part of the pot. So I'm gonna alternate between bringing it in more narrow and rounding off the shape down here. To round off the shape in that area, I'm gonna start in this part of the piece and I'm gonna rotate my hand as I sweep down, gently releasing pressure as I approach the middle part of the pot. After trimming a bit off, I'm gonna pause and feel the thickness that I have left by squeezing in with my fingers. It still feels pretty solid right here. I know I can trim some more right here, and I can certainly trim some more right there. I'm gonna keep bringing this in until it's the diameter I want and rounding out this bottom part. Once I have this set at the right diameter, I'm gonna trim by starting in the middle and slowly coming across to 3 o'clock. And you also might notice the thickness of my trimming scraps here. I'm trimming off the thickness of about an apple peel. That's about how thick these scraps are. If you notice that you're generating much thicker peelings as you're trimming, I'm going to recommend to back off the pressure a bit with your trimming tool. A common mistake people can make when going across the floor is to go too quickly or to go too deeply. If you have enough thickness of clay left, you can recover from something like this. Try and hold really steady and don't let the clay bump your hand as you slowly come out. Get a firm grip on your tool and cut off a little bit with each passing of the tool across the floor, and hopefully each time you come across it, it will become a little more even. I'm also doing a strong job here of using my left hand to hold my right hand steady. I got a gouge there on the side, so I'm going to get the same firm grip with my hand coming in from the side here, and I'm going to try and trim that off by holding steady. I'm noticing also that my trimming scraps are starting to stick onto the side of the piece a little bit. They're not flying off as readily as they could. That's because the clay is a little soft down in here. As I trimmed off some of the outer area, what's left in this thicker inside part is a little damp, and so they're kind of sticking on there. If you notice that the clay scraps are sticking a lot onto the side of your piece, you might just want to wait and let them firm up more, because this might be too soft. Also though, if you notice that when you're trimming, you're making dust or you're getting really fine shavings of clay coming off, it might be too dry, and it's certainly not good to make dust in your work environment at all. So you do not want to trim on these pieces when they're dry at all. It's better to just make new pots. You notice as I am bringing my tool down the piece that I'm really tapering off my pressure as I come down and start to bump on these 4 indents that are on the side wall of the piece. I want to keep it rounded down here. So I'm gonna sweep my tool down, and then as I approach that middle section, I'm really just tapering off on the pressure. I'm gonna use a slightly damp sponge and come over that area, smooth it out, and now I'm going to come with the rubber rib and really smooth it and press the grog back into the clay wall. I want to bring a surface back on this section of the piece that's as smooth as the rest of the pot. Just using my fingertips here to bring back a soft rounded quality to these indented bumps in the piece. And I want to make sure that there's no obvious line or mark right here from the area that I trimmed and the area that I didn't. So this foot area of my piece right now, I think of it as kind of like a little solid hockey puck on the bottom of the pot. And if you want to, you can come and hollow it out. You can turn it from being a solid hockey puck into being just a ring of clay, just a foot ring. So I'm going to hollow out the center area and just leave a raised ring here on the outside. I'm going to start in the middle, hold steady, and slowly come out to 3 o'clock. But this time, instead of going all the way off the edge, I'm going to stop right about here, and I'm going to leave a raised ring on the outer part of the foot area. And I'm just cutting away this middle part, and I'm going to hold here about a ½ inch away from the very edge. I can tell it's getting really thin right here in the center. So thin, I'm almost afraid to press on it. So I'm going to leave that area alone and just focus on trimming a little bit more out here. Now I'm going to clean up the ring that I have. I'm going to come on the inside where there's kind of a sharp corner right here, and I'm going to trim that back and round off this ring of clay all the way around. I'm cleaning up the inside part of the ring, around on the very bottom of the foot, and rounding it around to the outside part. This is a bowl that's all about being rounded, especially with these round divots in the side. So I'm going to smooth off the foot ring and make it perfectly rounded down here. But if your piece has angles in it, you could make your foot ring angular. There's all kinds of different profiles that you could have on the bottom of your pot. Yeah, I like how that shape and the size of the foot complements the piece overall. I'm going to go ahead and use my stamp. I'm pressing it against my finger, which is on the inside of the piece.